So as expected, TJ Watt got his another bag, $108 million guaranteed. Although as I said earlier, the big number here, the number that is out there for the press that people care about is the APY, the $41 million average per year. Myles Garrett got 40. TJ Watt got 41. And as we welcome in friend of the program and a man who hosts this show as well when Rich is not here, the great Tom Pelissero of NFL Network. Great to see you, sir.
Great to see you, although you look like color bars on my end. So I assume you look great as usual, Andrew. What's up to my boys in studio there as well?
Hey, what up, baby? Yes, color bars, which is a name for a band. It would be great. I would assume that the number for Micah Parsons needs to be like 41.1 or 41.5, and they could do this deal, Tom, before we get off the air today. Hypothetically, couldn't they?
It'll be higher than that.
Okay, so let's say 40. Let's say 42.
According to Jerry Jones himself, they had a handshake deal done back in March, but that ended up not getting finalized. A big piece of this is always the Cowboys want to do longer deals, strong cash flow up front, but then buy up team-friendly years on the back end of the contract. Mike has got a very experienced agent, David Mulugeta, whose name I'm sure by now Jerry Jones knows. Who prefers to do shorter deals. And so I don't know that at this point there's necessarily a rush based upon the fact that in Micah and Jerry's conversation, they knew where the number was going to be. It was always going to be north of 40. I believe it was always going to be north of 41. The real issue here is what does the structure look like and what is the length of the deal? I anticipate, and I know the Cowboys anticipate Micah showing up to Oxnard on time next week. Whether or not he practices remains an open question. He surprised them by actually doing some things back in OTAs in the spring that he did not have to do at that time. And then also you've got a couple other situations looming out there as well. In my mind, the Micah Parsons number was always going to be north of this. It was going to be closer in all likelihood to 45 than it was to 40. You've got
wait. 45.
I'm not saying it will be 45. I'm saying closer to 45 than 40 was likely the number, just because Micah is younger than Myles Garrett. Obviously, Myles is an unbelievably accomplished player, perennial Defensive Player of the Year candidate. But just based upon how these deals tend to go and how the markets tend to work, if a roughly 30-year-old player gets 40 and now a soon-to-be 31-year-old player gets 41, what does that mean for, I think Mike is 26, a 26-year-old Micah Parsons? And then Aiden Hutchinson is another one. He's coming off of a obviously significant injury. Everything seems like it's all systems go. He's in a different spot because they don't have to necessarily do something. But if the Lions want to get ahead of the market, and once Micah gets out there in training camp, once Aiden gets out there in training camp and looks like himself, maybe the Lions try to jump in here too, just because Micah's deal is in all likelihood going to blow this out of the water. And all that is with the backdrop of Trey Hendrickson, who is almost exactly the same age as TJ Watt, has not been asking for upwards of $40 million. The Bengals to this point have not wanted to do the type of multi-year commitment in terms of an extension with Trey Hendrickson that he wants. And there's a fair argument. I'm not saying that, now this adjusts the expectations or anything else, but if TJ Watt, who has been, more beat up physically, did not produce as well down the stretch last season, had fewer sacks than Trey Hendrickson, is the same age. If he's getting 41, why would Trey Hendrickson not be right in that same type of a bandwidth? So there's a bunch of different interconnected parts. We talked about this, Andrew, on Super Bowl Sunday on NFL Network, that this was going to be the offseason of the pass rusher. You saw Max Crosby, Myles Garrett, Danielle Hunter get their deals early in the offseason. Now you see TJ Watt. The big pieces remaining are Micah Parsons, who I believe that one ultimately will get done. I said a couple of weeks ago on this show, TJ Watt will get done before training camp in all likelihood, and it'll be north of Myles Garrett. That part happened. Micah Parsons, I would tell you, was always going to be north even of this number. I still anticipate that gets done prior to the start of the regular season, but it may not be in the structure that the Cowboys want. Aiden Hutchinson, we'll see when they decide to, put the pedal to the metal here. He's got no reason to be in a rush himself. And then Trey Hendrickson is the one that's, of course, been the ugliest of all these. Yes, TJ Watt also skipped minicamp, but Trey Hendrickson has literally shown up during a practice and held a press conference about how ticked off he is with the organization. Are we going to get another one of those as the Bengals get set to report to training camp next week? I know Trey's been up in that area, doing community work and things like that. It's entirely possible. That's the one that's the most curious in this, particularly because, again, for anybody who doubted that a pass rusher on the wrong side of age 30, as it historically has been, could get 40 plus $million. Well, TJ Watt just disproved that. And if anything, the Trey Hendrickson price, you would think just logically now has to go up.
Yeah, let's unpack that one, because to me, Trey Hendrickson is the most fascinating of them all. I agree with you. Micah, look, the Cowboys report to what used to be the Residence Inn in Oxnard on Monday. I whatever, he'll be there, and when he practices, call me when he does. Trey Hendrickson, though, I wouldn't be stunned, Tom, if he doesn't show up. He's actually 2 months younger than TJ Watt. I don't think people realize that. And the last 2 years collectively, the 23 and 24 seasons, nobody has more sacks in the NFL than Trey Hendrickson. Nobody has more sacks. Yet,
and listen, TJ's pushed through a lot. Okay, I don't mean to in any way minimize what TJ Watt has done, but if you just look at the injury report, he's had some pretty significant types of injuries. Look down the stretch of last season. If memory serves, I don't believe TJ Watt registered a sack in the Steelers' last 3 games last year, including the playoff game. And the whole defense didn't play well. Obviously, there's all kinds of issues that Pittsburgh had, which is why now they've revamped the roster the way that they have. But Trey Hendrickson is a guy who, remember, a year ago, back in the summer of 2024, requested a trade and then ultimately showed up and went through it because the Bengals had challenged him, according to Hendrickson, to say, hey, go out and do it again, and then we'll get the contract addressed. Well, he goes out and leaves the league in sacks, yet here we are talking about whether or not they should make a multi-year extension offer to a guy who remains one of the most productive players. TJ Watt just got $108 million fully guaranteed. Trey Hendrickson has not been asking for $108 million fully guaranteed. He hasn't been asking for over $40 million per year. To this point, the Bengals have not been willing to give him what he is asking for. Do the Bengals move at this point? Does this get even uglier? A trade is hard to imagine because when they actually did at least explore that and accept calls before the draft, nobody was willing to offer him a first-round pick. There's still a lot of different directions that one could go. Obviously, Trey Hendrickson means a lot to the Bengals' hopes, you would think, in 2025, particularly at a time that they're still going through it with their first-round pick as well.
Yeah, and you kind of went where I wanted to go, and that is with Hendrickson and TJ Watt. So you have the Bengals here who have the Shamar Stewart thing hanging over their head. They wrote the check for Jamar Chase. Before that, they had written checks for Joe Burrow and Orlando Brown. Brown coming from Kansas City. That had been a big check in free agency a couple of years ago as well. T. Higgins got that deal. It's not as much guaranteed beyond year one as I think a lot of people think, but regardless, they wrote a check. They signed both those guys. They denied all the skeptics there, and they got those deals done. Mike Brown is not one to just open up the cash spigot and say, hey, here's more cash for all of you, Trey Hendrickson included. He is one to tell you, hey, I have a deal and you have a contract and you're going to show up and you're going to play. So I guess my question is, if the league doesn't, whether it's fair or not, see Trey Hendrickson the same way they see TJ Watt, and some of that is media creation and the Steelers everything with that. I get that. And we're past the draft, to your point, so a deal right now doesn't seem likely. It doesn't help the Bengals this year. Is there a scenario in which Trey Hendrickson goes Carson Palmer, where Trey Hendrickson goes, you know what, I am the latest in the line of Bengals big-name guys who later in their career, throw Andrew Whitworth in there as well. He eventually sucked it up, and then he went to L.A., and he wrote the next chapter in his career. But is Trey Hendrickson the guy, Tom Pelissero, to go, you know what, I am willing to sit at home?
He's already said he's not playing on this contract.
Yeah.
He said that directly when he showed up in May to an open to the media practice, walked onto the practice field dressed in like khakis and a polo shirt and said, I'm not coming in for that. So I do not anticipate. Listen, all these things are fluid, Andrew. We've seen things that seem to be going one way, and then they all of a sudden the pendulum swings back. I do not believe without a new contract that Trey Hendrickson is reporting. I think they're next Tuesday report date for the veterans. I don't think that he is there throughout the course of the preseason without a new contract, at least up until the point that he would need to play. And it would not surprise me. I'm not saying this is going to happen. I'm not putting words in Trey Hendrickson's mouth because I am absolutely certain that more words will come out of Trey Hendrickson's mouth if it keeps going on like this. But I would absolutely not be surprised if he sits out games. You're talking about missing $1 million per game check, but you're also talking about a guy who this is his time to get one more really big bite at the apple. He's determined to get that. So stay tuned on the Trey Hendrickson situation. It has not seemed like this was a deal that was like impossible to do. They're not on completely different pages in terms of like what the money would be, but the Bengals have not moved the way that Trey Hendrickson would want to move. We know what he wants. He's said it publicly, Andrew. He wants a multi-year extension. He wants a multi-year commitment from the Bengals after that 1-year extension he did a couple of years ago. He doesn't want to go down that road again. He doesn't want to kick the can and have to address this again in 2026. The Bengals are saying this is what we are willing to do. Eventually, somebody has to blink, and I don't anticipate that at least in the next few days here, it's going to be Trey Hendrickson.
All right, rookies reporting for a lot of teams. The teams in for the Hall of Fame game already have their team. Jim Harbaugh, beg your pardon, 5 feet from where we sit right now, has his Chargers on the field. And then his whole thing yesterday about catching 22 foul balls was just bonkers. We'll play that later.
Interestingly, the Chargers, they had their rookies in a week ago.
Yeah.
The Lions, who are the other team in the Hall of Fame game, are not reporting yet. They don't come in until tomorrow. It's always an interesting strategy because I've talked to people within the league. Several people out of nowhere, just coaches, have said, oh man, I talked to my buddies with the Chargers. I can't believe they're already in camp. There is some of that belief among certain coaches within the league that it's such a long season already. Now you had the Hall of Fame game. Now you're weeks out from that. Now you're bringing in the rookies even earlier that you're going to wear people out. Obviously, the Lions had some level of concern about that by delaying even by a few days their report date here. But we also know Jim Harbaugh, more is more. He can't wait to get back to work. He gave 7 different metaphors yesterday, Andrew.
Yeah, and they're all biblical too.
It's the birth of Jesus Christ.
He went from
any number of other things here.
Birth of Jesus to catching foul balls in an empty Tiger Stadium upper deck as a kid. It was an all-timer. It was a roller coaster. And the Hall of Fame game is 2 weeks from yesterday. So we're still a full 2 weeks away. But as teams report and as rookies report and as the second-round picks start finally signing, that dam has broken. Tom, there's the speculation or the thought at least that Quinshon Judkins, who was arrested last week in Ohio with a domestic violence allegation, the Browns' second-round pick, the 36th overall pick, and their second-round pick beyond Carson Schlesinger, who is signed and is ready to report here, that he will not be there today for the Browns as he focuses on his legal issues. What can you tell us about that?
Well, there's some moving parts here, Andrew, because you've got an active domestic violence case in the state of Florida. There have been documents that have been released on that. By all indications, not only do you have documentation of injuries suffered by the woman who identified herself as in a relationship with Quinshon Judkins, but presumably you also have photos, you have other evidence. The NFL usually waits for the legal system to render anything in terms of a suspension. However, it's written into the collective bargaining agreement that if the commissioner believes that a violation, if the evidence leads the commissioner to believe that a violation likely occurred, then they can use the exempt list to take him off the field. In other words, Andrew, if Quinshon Judkins were to show up, sign his contract, the NFL as soon as today could go, actually, no, you're not going to be on the field. So it really behooves everyone to exercise some level of patience. We've not seen any statements, any quotes, anything from Quinshon Judkins or his agent to this point. We know one side of the story, which is what the woman told police in partially in a 911 call that was also released. And then in terms of the document here, he was arrested. He was charged with misdemeanor domestic violence. It's certainly a serious case. The NFL many times, virtually every time, has rendered greater discipline than the criminal justice system, even when ultimately there's no, finding of any type of guilt in terms of the judicial system here. So again, a lot of different moving parts with Quinshon Judkins. It would make sense that the Browns want him to focus on that because again, Andrew, even if he showed up, even if they did the deal, and by the way, at 36, that would be the next slot that potentially would be fully guaranteed. It would not make a whole lot of sense for him to show up right now. For the Browns, it would be the proverbial distraction. Obviously, it's more serious than that. I'm not trying to minimize that. For Quinshon Judkins, it might just lead to him going on the exempt list, from which, Andrew, there's no sign. It's not like that's a finite thing. He could end up on that for a long period of time. taking their time moving forward here, is probably the best course of action. While the NFL again continues to review whatever facts, and knowing that ultimately whatever the final outcome is from the NFL's perspective, that part probably doesn't even happen until after this has run its course in the legal system.
I'm talking to Tom Pelissero. Have about a minute left here. So the story, Tom, deserves more than a minute, but let's boil it down because that's the point of the question. When the average fan hears last night that the head of the union, the NFLPA, Lloyd Howell, resigns, and honestly, it's midsummer and they couldn't care less about conflicts of interest with private equity and all of that and collusion. Like the average fan is on summer vacation. And when you tell them, oh, my God, did you see this? They're like, all right, well, how does it affect me as the average fan? Or how does it affect the game that I love? My first reaction is, well, when you have negotiation on a longer season, which we all believe that is inevitable, there will be a new person in charge on the other side of the table. Beyond that, why should the average fan spend a lot of time thinking about Lloyd Howell?
Well, at this point, Lloyd Howell has removed himself from the situation, which is obviously an unfortunate ending that nobody expected when about roughly 2 years ago he was named to that post to succeed DeMaurice Smith, who had been close to 2 decades in the executive director post. There are parallels here, Andrew, and this is probably as close as I'll ever get to mentioning politics here or anywhere else, but there are parallels that I see to Elon Musk and the Department of Government Efficiency. When Lloyd Howell was hired, it was because of his business acumen, and this is based upon quotes from executive committee members, J.C. Treader at the time. They wanted him. They thought that they had an overly bloated business. There were obviously a ton of long-term employees. They thought that they could be more streamlined. They thought they could be more efficient. And so there were dozens, some of them long-time NFL Players Association employees who suddenly were no longer employed by the union. Well, what happens when dozens of longtime employees are no longer working someplace? There might be 1 or 2 of them that might not be happy with that, and suddenly you begin to have blowback that rightly or wrongly and in leaks and other things that are directed at the person who ultimately was in charge. And that person just decides to say, you know what, I don't need this. I'm going to do something else. That is a story, Andrew, that I think for anybody who has followed the federal government over the last 6 months can understand some of the parallels to that here. I would say why people should care is because sometime in the next 5 years, and I would say sooner than later, there are going to be negotiations on a new collective bargaining agreement. It potentially quite likely will include a negotiation over going to an 18-game regular season schedule. It will include the possibility of ripping up the various broadcasting deals, extending them, continuing to rethink them at a time that they've become more fragmented, obviously, to different streaming services and things. And ultimately, you're hoping, if you're a football fan, that there's no disruption. And who the NFLPA names to that post is going to have a heavy hand in exactly what direction things go. Lloyd Howell, again, came from a business background. He was a businessman. He was not a former trial lawyer, a federal prosecutor like DeMaurice Smith, who was, again, you could argue this either way, rightly or wrongly, but he did not mind confrontation. He was not afraid to fire back when you would see quotes. You didn't see that from Lloyd Howell. He felt the best way was do deals. And he did a lot of small deals, side deals and things to try to improve various aspects of the CBA while also having an eye to potentially opening up that agreement sooner than later. In the short term, the Board of Representatives at some point, possibly as soon as today, is going to meet. They're going to have to take steps to name an interim executive director, which there's no clause in the CBA or the NFLPA Constitution for what happens if the executive director steps down. There are a few logical candidates, people who are or have been with the union. Tom DePasso, who's been the longtime he's done a lot of things on the salary cap side, the legal side. He would be a potential option, but he was one of those people who was cycling out. It was not going to be with the union after the end of this year. Don Davis is another one who's been on the player affairs side. And then George Atala, who up until a few months ago was the assistant executive director of external affairs, I think was his title. He was essentially the number 2 in many ways in command to DeMaurice Smith. He left the NFLPA. He's one of the few people outside of D. Smith who know all the ins and outs of it. I could see any of those 3 people being potential candidates. to allow the executive committee, however they decide to run this process, to run a thorough, quite possibly more transparent process than they ran with Lloyd Howell, to find the right person to set them up. Because as much as 5 years, Andrew, is a lifetime here, in terms of how many seasons and how many of the guys that are even in the league now are going to be in the league by 2030. But for a football fan, if you're thinking 5 years out, that is not a long way to avoid work stoppages, ugliness. You want to know that the train is going to keep moving forward here. And so the person hired is going to be very, very important. But for the next 6 months, Andrew, I would imagine, yes, the attention for most people watching the show certainly is going to turn to the action on the field.
Yeah, but that's coming quickly. And there's another guy on the other side of the table. The other guy on the other side of the camera is Tom Pelissero, the great NFL Network Insider.
Catch the Rich Eisen Show live weekdays from 12 to 3 p.m. Eastern on Roku Sports Channel in the U.S.